Okay, I am back and I could talk slower because I have 15 more minutes. Too cheap to pay for the paid version of Screencast. Anyway, I'm back and I'm picking up where we left off because I told you I didn't want to rush through talking about the importance of Washington's farewell address. Um, Washington served for 2 terms, and he did strongly believe that in order to keep any one person from amassing too much power, that he should not run for a third term. Now, at that point in time, there was no limitation on the office of the presidency in terms of term limits. The term limits that exist today are as a result of an amendment that was added to the Constitution, the 22nd Amendment, in the 1950s after FDR had been elected for 4 terms. But going back to Washington's time, there were no term limits. He could have run for a third term, but he set a precedent. It's a pretty good precedent, too. He didn't feel that it would be right to be the president for a third term. Plus, he was getting older. And he felt that it would be a good example to future presidents to emphasize the point that being in office for a long time, he would amass a certain amount of power, and that power should be limited. So he chose not to run. And it's interesting. At his farewell address, these are some of the items that he warned the country about: sectionalism and secession. The issue of slavery. In 1793, Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin, and that kind of like set the potential for the future expansion of that institution or practice. And we'll kind of talk more about that as we get into other units. He also warned against political parties. He saw how Hamilton and Jefferson fought within his administration, and he saw that they both represented different political interests, and believed that that was very dangerous for the country. Considering what the country is going through this week with the new president, or who will be the new president, you could see that the country is very much divided, the political parties today, between the Democrats and Republicans. Their division is different and based on different ideas or notions than the parties of Washington's time period, but the fact that they are divided remains to be an issue. And then the last thing that he warned the American people of, the United States getting involved in entangling alliances with other countries. Well, this is very interesting, and you might not think it's was very relevant at the time, but the American Revolution influenced other revolutions. And in 1789, the French Revolution broke out around the same time period that Washington became president of the United States. And I think I have a slide on the French Revolution. So let me go forward here. Yeah. So it broke out in 1789, and the United States had to decide how it was going to support France, who was an old ally. The French had joined in the American Revolution in 1778 after the Americans were victorious at the Battle of Saratoga against the British. Saratoga's in New York, and that kind of marked the turning point of that conflict. Thereafter, a famous Frenchman, the Marquis de Lafayette, came to the colonies and joined the American cause against the British, and they formed an alliance that the Americans said would last into perpetuity. There I go again with the words, perpetuity. And, when revolution broke out in France, the French looked toward the Americans for their support, again, especially as it pertained to the conflict that began to exist between France and Britain. Like a lot of the upper class people in France had fled to England at the time, and this created some conflict with the revolutionaries in France. If you've never read Tale of Two Cities, read it. It's a good book. It's all about that. Fictionalized, but still quite good. But anyways, so the United States had to decide how they were going to support France. And Washington in 1793 wrote a proclamation of neutrality. He felt that the country was still in a critical period of its development. They had a massive amount of debt. Their military was not strong or organized. It was a miracle that they were able to defeat the British, but we could get into a whole bunch of other reasons as to what contributed to American victory against the British. But their military was not in the position to go and fight a foreign war. So Washington signed that proclamation of neutrality. But if you're familiar with the history of the French Revolution, it went through multiple phases, and even after Washington's time in office, so when he left the office of the presidency in 1796, the conflict continued to rear on, and John Adams, who became the second president of the United States, really inherited a lot of the problems related to the conflict in France. And I'll kind of move on to the next slide because you can see some of the issues that Adams faced during his time in office. The first 3 points are during Washington's administration, and you can use these on that worksheet that I presented to you in the previous video. And I mentioned the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. It's interesting because there were revolutionaries in France who had come to the United States, Citizen Genet particularly, to make an appeal to Washington and to gain American support for that conflict in France. It was really ended up being an embarrassment for Washington that the Citizen Genet, who was a person, could surreptitiously come to the country and try and muster up support without the permission of Washington. Washington ended up expelling him, but either way, it was a mar on Washington's time in office. It's nothing that really affected his popularity very greatly, but either way, it was an embarrassment, if you will. And Jay's Treaty was one that kind of like secured American interests in different territories around the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. So that was another success of Washington's administration. But then, as I said, when John Adams became president, the conflict in France continued, and what really broke out between the United States and France was a quasi-war. You should look up the definition of a quasi-war if you've never heard it, but essentially what it means is a undeclared war. So they were in conflict against one another, and the United States really had to deal with the British on the open seas as well, because what the British had made a practice of was impressing American sailors. So Americans traveling on ships for trade and whatnot were being kidnapped by British and French ships. And this created trouble for the United States. Adams sent an emissary, a group of men to try and settle the conflict, and it is known in history as the XYZ affair. And the French regime tried to bribe them. They left very upset that they could not negotiate peace, and it only further fueled the flames between the two countries. Adams, in response, passed what was called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which put limitations on the naturalization of French residents in the United States, and it also put limitations on American freedom of speech as it related to that conflict that was going on in France. Along with that, along with that, some resolutions were passed, I should say, by Congress called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which protested the Alien and Sedition Acts, calling for the states to have power to nullify them, because Jefferson and Madison really looked upon these as violations of Americans' freedoms that were protected under the Bill of Rights. So this conflict that Adams inherited was very difficult, as it led to not only foreign issues, but also a number of domestic issues related to equality and freedom in the young country. And even during his administration, this tension between the two parties continued and formalized, really. The Federalists continued on, and they last into like the 18 teens and 1820s. And the Anti-Federalists really formulate into what was then called the Democratic Republicans. So when you watch the video about the political parties, you'll come to understand what they stood for. The Federalists believed in the Constitution and a loose constructionist approach to interpreting the Constitution. They advocated rule by the best people, like people who had long time experience in government. They distrusted a full democracy, hence the Constitution creating a federal system that created a more centralized government. Hamilton, who was really pro-British in terms of the policies that he was making, created a strong economic plan in his mind that would more centralize the government and lead the country into a progressive direction that would secure trade and wealth for American people. And the Democratic Republicans had really a different vision, and I kind of talked about this in the last video. And largely part of their angst against the Federalists was the institution of slavery. Like a lot of these Democratic Republicans, especially in the South, were believed in a future that was more agrarian oriented and the protection of that institution. So you can see this is a good PowerPoint for you to use, and I'll kind of take you back to the beginning for you to use on the activity that you're doing this week as you consider the administrations of Washington and Adams. Okay, so I'll take me back up mid-screen. So I know it seems like you don't have a lot of work this week with those two activities, but I can't again stress enough the importance of those first two administrations, and especially for you to see how the new Constitution was interpreted and was carried out through Washington and Adams, respectively. So have a good week, have a productive week. Contact me if you have any questions, and I'm happy to help. And next week we will get ready for the unit test. Bye.